All right, so that's the Cluniac and Cistercian first and second waves of monastic reform in the High Middle Ages. As you get into the 13th century, you get a third wave of reform, which basically has to do with this idea of religious poverty that you find with the Cistercians. It's a powerful idea that turns out not to be able to keep contained inside of monastery walls. Up to this point, monasteries, well, this religious life, monastic life, had been in monasteries that are convents. They've got a wall, the monks enter them, take vows. They're not supposed to leave them, or at least not without the permission of the abbot, and they're supposed to be kind of sealed off from the outside world. Never perfectly, they're always influential and influenced by uh, things from outside, but still, that's the ideal, is that they are these closed, cloistered institutions. But the ideas spill out, start getting picked up elsewhere. As we'll talk about in the future, there's a commercial revolution going on. Towns are springing back up. Trade is increasing. Merchant classes are increasing. And in the moral anxiety that people have over all the new wealth and all the new trade and all the things that are going on, people start responding to that with religious ideals, calling for the idea that maybe the life of poverty, the life of voluntary poverty, of renunciation of your wealth is really the high road to go, is the thing that's needed for people to come to God and seek a higher spirituality that way. And so you see the life of poverty really spreading out, a whole poverty movement, a religious poverty movement. Um, a lot of this is very ad hoc, is very improvised. You get people spontaneously taking to the roads, taking to the streets, preaching poverty, preaching repentance, and wanting to live a life of self-denial, kind of on their own without the direction of a established monastic order, which makes other people really nervous, makes church authorities really, really nervous. Sort of, who are all these loose cannon going around preaching on their own and making all these claims about the way to heaven or the way to God, or, what the true religious life is. So there's a lot of potential friction there. There's a lot of tension there. You have cases where some of these groups, like the Waldensians in France, get into conflict with a local bishop who tries to shut them down or force them to adopt a more regulated way of life, and they refuse to do so, saying they should follow the ways of God rather than the ways of men, and wind up getting condemned as heretics, which actually sometimes pushes the groups to become more radical and more different from traditional or institutional forms of Christianity than already existed. You get these sort of heretical movements, in some ways getting created by the bishops cracking down on them more than anything. In other cases, it does get folded into and accepted within the existing church frameworks. A classic example here would be St. Francis, who picks up on these poverty ideals early in the 13th century, early in the 1200s. Takes to the streets, preaching poverty, preaching repentance, preaching a sort of more personal, individual approach to God. Gets into conflict with his family. It sort of tries to get him clamped down on by the local bishop, but the local bishop decides, instead of condemning Francis's way of life, to actually embrace him and permit him to do it, and gives him his protection. Winds up sending him down to Rome to get the authorization of the Pope, so that eventually you wind up with Francis and his Franciscans, this way of life, coming to be adopted as an additional form of religious life. It's different from it's related to monasticism. You get the same sort of ideals of prayer and celibacy and self-denial and this kind of a thing, but it's not cloistered, right? It's not within monastery walls. Rather, they're supposed to be out in the world, preaching to people. And the other thing, which is going to become a major theme and a major controversy with the Franciscans and others like them, is that they take the ideal of religious poverty extremely seriously and hold that the true religious life should entail owning no property whatsoever, right? Living rather on the generosity of people in the street day by day, begging for your daily bread, going around and preaching and living on whatever people choose to give you. Now, this has some implications, right? This is one of the reasons why church authorities are not necessarily always all that happy about them. The Franciscans and others like them, the Dominicans and others, they're called mendicant orders. Mendicant from the Latin word for begging, because of this practice of poverty and the idea that they're begging for their sustenance rather than owning property. Like I say, this can be controversial because, of course, the bishops and the pope and the priests and the established, the regular church, and for that matter, the monasteries are wealthy, right? They've got a lot of wealth. They've got a lot of power. They've got silken robes and golden mitres and staffs and stained glass windows in the churches and all this stuff. Um, so some of them, can feel threatened, can feel criticized, the sort of sense that, these people are going around saying poverty is the right way to go. The Franciscans and Dominicans are very careful to say, this is a matter of individual choice if you want to pursue this way of life, and not use it to directly criticize the church authorities. But it's not that hard for people to put two and two together, and find the mendicants preferable to their local parish priest, to the local bishop, or what have you. So there's potential conflict there. There's also the issue of, okay, once you have authorized these people, and once you do say this is an acceptable way of life for people to serve the church with, is the church going to just sort of sit there and let people starve to death if the begging doesn't go well that day, right? There's sort of a genuine humanitarian concern there, which the Pope and the bishops are trying to sort out how they're going to handle it. And eventually they work out a kind of a compromise idea where they say, okay, you Franciscans, you Dominicans, you don't have to have any property that you own yourselves, but the bishop of the town you're in is going to set up a house where he's going to have some beds and some food and a kitchen and, everything you need. And it's not yours. You don't own it. The bishop owns it, so you don't have to worry about your poverty thing. You're still poor and you don't own anything. But it's there for you to use it, and hint, 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 we expect you to use it, right? So that way you make sure that they are being taken care of and you don't have preachers, starving to death or otherwise having unsavory things happening to them as they're exposed out on the street. So that's a compromise that winds up kicking in. Of course, that can very rapidly become a bit of a fiction. You wind up with branches of the Franciscan order that, as usual, these ideals are hard to sustain over the long term in practice. They do become wealthy. The fat friar, sort of Friar Tuck from the Robin Hood stories, that kind of becomes a medieval stereotype, a sort of hypocritical figure. So it's out there. But you also get others who very sincerely try to follow the ideals and maintain poverty and live lives of great self-denial. So you get both extremes going on. Okay, so the key thing here, sort of look over what I've been saying in the prior video lecture and this one, is that you've got this succession of waves of reform in the monasteries aimed at concerns about the possible corruption of the monasteries, the possibility that they may not be fulfilling their original spiritual ideals. The Cluniac wave in the 10th century, trying to withdraw the church from political control by secular lords, really. The Cistercian and associated orders reforms at the end of the 11th and through the 12th century, aimed at a more economic dimension, trying to pursue a life of religious poverty, and a more emotional type of spirituality. And then the mendicant orders, like the Franciscans and the Dominicans, trying to take that poverty ideal even further, take it out of the cloister, take it into the cities, make it a preaching ideal as well, and a more hardcore poverty practice as well. They also, by the way, what I was talking about, a more heightened emotional religious culture, more sort of affection and these warm emotions of pity and mercy, that also gets picked up by the Franciscans and Dominicans and carried forward into their activities as well. Okay, so far so good. So that's on the whole monastic side, right? Where you really see these reform movements originating and taking their chief form. Now, you're also going to see church reform movements in the High Middle Ages from 1000 down to, say, around 1300. We talked about the early Middle Ages from 500 to 1000, High Middle Ages around 1000 down to about 1300. In the High Middle Ages, you also see church reform in the other part of the church, what we call the secular church, which may sound like an odd phrase. But the secular church means, the word secular means worldly. The secular church is the part of the church which is dealing with ordinary people, right? The priests in their parishes, the bishops in their cathedrals, people who are performing baptisms and marriages and funerals and preaching to people. They're not behind monastery walls. That's called the regular church because they're regulated. So the unusual churchmen are the regular churchmen because they're regulated to the regular church. And the church actually bringing religion to people is the secular church because they deal with the world. So those terms get a little bit confusing to us sometimes. But anyway, the other side of the church of the bishops, the priests, the popes, that's going to have a whole other angle. Basically, the secular church